Martin Van Buren was an American politician who served as the 8th President of the United States, a member of the Democratic Party. He served in a number of other senior roles, including 8th Vice President and 10th Secretary of State, both under Andrew Jackson. Van Buren won the presidency by promising to follow through on Jackson's policies. Shortly after taking office, the Panic of 1837 struck the nation, and his inability to deal effectively with the economic crisis, combined with the growing political strength of the opposition Whig Party, led to his defeat in the 1840 presidential election. During his half-century of public service, he built, perfected, and defended a new system of political parties at first the state and then the federal level. In New York he reorganized the Democratic-Republican Party and established the Albany Regency to keep it in power. He then moved on Washington, where he did more than anyone to construct the modern Democratic Party, which dominated American politics down to the American Civil War. A delegate to a political convention at age 18, he quickly moved from local to state politics, gaining fame both as a political organizer and an accomplished lawyer. Elected to the Senate by the New York State Legislature in 1821, Van Buren supported William H. Crawford for president in the 1824 election, but by 1828 had come to support Jackson. Van Buren was a major supporter and organizer for Jackson in the 1828 election, and ran for governor of New York in the hope of using his personal popularity to boost Jackson's campaign. Jackson and Van Buren were elected, and after serving as governor for 2 months, Van Buren resigned to become Jackson's Secretary of State. During Jackson's 8 years as president, Van Buren was a key advisor, and built the organizational structure for the coalescing Democratic Party, particularly in New York. In 1831, following his resignation as Secretary of State, which aided Jackson in resolving the Petticoat affair, Jackson gave Van Buren a recess appointment as American Minister to Britain. Van Buren's nomination was rejected by the Senate, cutting short his service in London, but he was elected vice president in the 1832 election. Van Buren faced little opposition for the presidential nomination at the 1835 Democratic National Convention, and he defeated several Whig opponents in the 1836 presidential election. Van Buren was the first president to be born a United States citizen of Dutch ancestry. He is the only president who spoke English as a second language, and was the first not to have a university degree or a military commission. As president, Van Buren was blamed for the Depression of 1837. Hostile newspapers called him Martin Van Ruin. He attempted to cure the economic problems by keeping control of federal funds in an independent treasury, rather than in state banks. But Congress would not approve of this until 1840. In foreign affairs, he denied the application of Texas for admission to the Union, unwilling to upset the balance of free and slave states in the Missouri Compromise, and hoping to avoid war with Mexico over Texas annexation. Additionally, relations with Britain and its colonies in Canada proved to be strained from the bloodless Aroostook War and the Caroline Affair. In the 1840 election, Van Buren was voted out of office, losing to Whig candidate William Henry Harrison. Van Buren was the leading candidate for the Democratic nomination in 1844, but lost to James K. Polk, who went on to win the election. In the 1848 election, Van Buren ran unsuccessfully as the candidate of the anti-slavery Free Soil Party. He returned to the Democratic fold to endorse Franklin Pierce, James Buchanan, and Stephen A. Douglas for the presidency. However, his increasingly abolitionist views and support for the Union led him to support Abraham Lincoln's policies after the start of the American Civil War. Van Buren's health began to fail in 1861, and he died in July 1862 at the age of 79. Early life and education. Baptismal record from Kunhardt Dutch Reformed Church. Van Buren's name was spelled Martin in Dutch, and he was baptized on December 15, 1782. Martin Van Buren was born on December 5, 1782, in the village of Kunhardt, New York, about 20 miles south of Albany on the Hudson River. Van Buren was the first president not born a British subject, or even of British ancestry. Martin Van Buren's mother was Maria Hose, or Goes, Van Allen Van Buren. She had been married to Johannes Van Allen. After Johannes' death, she married Abraham Van Buren in 1776. Although both were fifth-generation Dutch, all of Abraham and Maria Van Buren's forebears were of Dutch ancestry, as was the case for most of Kunhardt's residents, and they still spoke Dutch as their first language. The middle child in terms of age of 9 children, Martin Van Buren was baptized on December 15, 1772, as Martin Van Buren, the original Dutch spelling of his name. Van Buren had 4 full siblings and 3 half-siblings. Dirk Van Buren married Buren Hose. Buren Hose was the brother of Martin Van Buren's wife, and served in local offices including town clerk. Jeanette J. called Hannah, or Jane, Van Buren, who never married and resided with her sister Dirkie Van Buren and brother-in-law Buren Hose. Lawrence Van Buren, a store owner and attorney who served as a militia officer in the War of 1812 and held local offices including town supervisor of Kunhardt, postmaster, and presidential elector in 1852. Abraham Van Buren, an attorney who served as Columbia County surrogate after Martin Van Buren and James I. Van Allen. Van Buren received a basic education at the village schoolhouse and briefly studied Latin at the Kunhardt Academy and at Washington Seminary in Clover Rock. Van Buren was small in stature. As an adult he was 5 feet 6 inches tall, and often referred to as Little Van. Quote, Van Buren married Hannah Hose, his childhood sweetheart and first cousin once removed, on February 21, 1807, in Catskill, New York. Early political career. Van Buren had been active in politics from at least the age of 18, when he attended a Democratic-Republican Party convention in Troy, New York, where he worked successfully to secure for John Peter Van Ness the party nomination in a special election for the 6th Congressional District seat. Van Buren was a member of the New York State Senate from 1813 to 1820, and joined the opposition party in 1813. The opposition party were Democratic Republicans who fought DeWitt Clinton for control of the Democratic Republican Party in New York. Van Buren served as New York Attorney General from 1815 to 1819. He replaced William Floyd as a presidential elector in 1820, and voted for James Monroe and Daniel D. Tompkins, though he never served in the military. During the War of 1812, Van Buren worked in the state Senate to pass war measures, including bills to expand the New York militia and increase soldier pay. In addition, he was a special judge advocate appointed to serve as one of the prosecutors of William Hull during Hull's court-martial following the surrender of Detroit. At first he opposed DeWitt Clinton's plan for the Erie Canal, but he supported it when the Bucktails, the name given to the anti-DeWitt Clinton Democratic Republicans, were able to gain a majority on the Erie Canal Commission, and he supported a bill that raised money for the canal through the sale of state bonds. From 1816 to 1829, Van Buren served as a member of the University of the State of New York Board of Regents. He was the leading figure in the Albany Regency, a group of Bucktail leaders who for more than a generation dominated the politics of New York and influenced national politics. The Regency, together with other political organizations such as Tammany Hall, played a major role in expanding the spoils system and making it a recognized and accepted procedure. He was the prime architect of the first nationwide political party. The Jacksonian Democrats are Democratic Party, which evolved from the Democratic Republicans and relied on party loyalty and patronage to prevent contentious sectional issues, including tariffs and slavery, from becoming national crises. In Van Buren's words, without strong national political organizations, there would be nothing to moderate the prejudices between free and slave-holding states. Quote, early in his life Van Buren owned a slave, a man named Tom, who served as his personal valet. Tom ran away in 1814 and eventually settled in Canada, with Van Buren making no effort to locate him. In 1824 Tom was found to be living in Worcester, Massachusetts, since he still legally owned Tom. Under New York's gradual emancipation law, slavery was scheduled to be completely abolished in the state in 1827. Van Buren privately agreed to sell Tom to the finder for $50, provided the finder, a resident of Rensselaer County, could guarantee that Tom would be captured without violence. He could not make such a guarantee, and his willingness to pay was lessened by the knowledge that Tom would be emancipated in fewer than 3 years even if he was re-enslaved. So Tom remained free, as Van Buren probably intended. Allowing Tom to remain in Massachusetts unmolested without notice enabled Van Buren to avoid offending Southern slave owners, as he would do if he publicly allowed a former slave to remain free. At the same time, he avoided offending Northern abolitionists, which he would do if he captured and re-enslaved a former slave. U.S. Senate and national politics. In February 1821, Martin Van Buren was elected a U.S. Senator from New York, defeating incumbent Nathan Sanford, who ran as the Clintonian candidate. In the presidential election of 1824, Van Buren supported the nominee of a congressional caucus, Treasury Secretary William H. Crawford, and received the electoral votes of Georgia for vice president. None of the presidential candidates, Crawford, John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson, or Henry Clay, had received a majority of the Electoral College votes. So the choice fell to the United States House of Representatives. The House had to choose from among the top 3 candidates, so Clay was eliminated. Van Buren had originally hoped to block John Quincy Adams by denying him the state of New York, which was divided between supporters of Crawford and Adams. However, Representative Stephen Van Rensselaer swung New York to Adams. Adams won, and appointed Clay as Secretary of State. Because Clay had supported Adams in the House election, Jackson and Crawford supporters alleged corruption. Always notably courteous in his treatment of opponents, Van Buren showed no bitterness toward either Adams or Henry Clay, and he voted for Clay's confirmation as Secretary of State, notwithstanding Jackson's corrupt bargain charge. Van Buren was not considered to be an exceptional orator like Henry Clay or Daniel Webster, but his more important speeches show careful preparation and his opinions carried weight. The oft-repeated charge that he refrained from declaring himself on crucial questions is hardly borne out by an examination of his senatorial career. In February 1827, he was re-elected to the Senate by a large majority. He became one of the recognized managers of the Jackson campaign, and his tour of Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia in the spring of 1827 won support for Jackson from Crawford as Van Buren sought to reorganize and unify the old Republican Party behind Jackson. Martin Van Buren's tenure as New York governor is the second shortest on record. While his term was short, he did manage to pass the Bank Safety Fund law, an early form of deposit insurance, through the legislature. Secretary of State. On March 5, 1829, President Jackson appointed Van Buren Secretary of State, an office which probably had been assured to him before the 1828 elections. and Van Buren resigned the governorship on March 12. He was succeeded by his lieutenant governor, Enos T. Troop, a member of the Regency. Secretary of State. As Secretary of State, Van Buren took care to keep on good terms with the Kitchen Cabinet, Jackson's informal advisors. He sometimes opposed Jackson in the matter of removing political appointees from office to replace them with Jackson loyalists, but also saw to the replacement of postmasters in New York with Van Buren loyalists. No serious diplomatic crises arose during Van Buren's tenure, but he achieved several notable successes, including the settlement of long-standing claims against France, winning reparations for property that had been seized during the Napoleonic Wars. He reached an agreement with the British to open trade with the British West Indies colonies. In addition, Van Buren completed a treaty with the Ottoman Empire that gained American merchants access to the Black Sea. Items on which he did not achieve success include settling the Maine New Brunswick boundary dispute with Great Britain, gaining settlement of the U.S. claim to the Oregon Country, concluding a commercial treaty with Russia, and persuading Mexico to sell Texas. Van Buren also advised Jackson informally on matters of domestic policy. In the controversy over the Bank of the United States, he sided with Jackson. He also sided with Jackson on the Indian Removal Act. Petticoat Affair. Late in Jackson's first term, Van Buren won the president's lasting regard by his courtesies to Peggy Eaton, wife of Secretary of War John H. Eaton, with whom the wives of the cabinet members and other Washington political figures had refused to associate over disapproval of the circumstances surrounding their marriage and what they considered her failure to meet the moral standards of a cabinet wife. Because Calhoun was the most visible opponent of the Jackson administration, Jackson felt that Calhoun and other anti-Jackson officials were fanning the flames of the Peggy Eaton controversy in an attempt to gain political leverage. The dispute was finally resolved when Van Buren offered to resign. In April 1831, Jackson accepted, and took the opportunity to reorganize his cabinet by asking for the resignations of cabinet members whose wives were part of the anti-Eaton coalition. Vice Presidency. After resigning as Secretary of State, Van Buren remained in office until June 1831, and afterwards continued to play a part in Jackson's kitchen cabinet. Calhoun was elated, convinced that he had ended Van Buren's career. "It will kill him dead, sir. Kill him dead. He will never kick, sir. Never kick," Calhoun exclaimed to a friend within earshot of Missouri Senator Thomas Hart Benton. Benton recognized the significance of Calhoun's action, saying, "You have broken a minister and made a vice president." Quote, as Benton and Tyler foresaw, Calhoun's move backfired by making Van Buren seem the victim of petty politics, thus raising him in both Jackson's regard and the esteem of others in the Democratic Party. Far from ending Van Buren's career, Calhoun's action gave greater impetus to Van Buren's candidacy for vice president. After a brief tour of Europe, Van Buren reached New York on July 5, 1832. The May 1832 Democratic National Convention, the party's first, had nominated him for vice president on the Jackson ticket. The Jackson-Van Buren ticket won the election of 1832 by a landslide. Van Buren's support of Jackson in the nullification crisis and the decision not to recharter the Second Bank of the United States made him a target of Jackson's most vocal opponents. Van Buren was threatened with violence, including explicit comments from Senator George Poindexter of Mississippi, which caused Van Buren to carry pistols for self-defense. During one contentious debate on the bank issue, Van Buren presided over the Senate as Clay spoke passionately about the harm he believed Jackson's bank policy would cause, directing his remarks to Van Buren. Clay asked rhetorically whether Van Buren would approach Jackson and persuade him to change his mind. After Clay concluded, observers wondered how Van Buren would react. Van Buren's response was to descend from the rostrum and ask Clay if he could borrow a pinch of snuff. Caught off guard, Clay reflexively handed over his snuff box. Van Buren took a pinch, bowed to Clay, and left the chamber, both deflating the effect of Clay's remarks and preventing tension from escalating, as would have happened if Van Buren had attempted to reply directly. Presidential election of 1836. Jackson, not running in 1836, was determined to make Van Buren his successor in order to continue the Jackson administration's policies on the issue of slavery. Van Buren moved to obtain the support of Southerners by assuring them that he opposed abolitionism and supported the maintaining of slavery in states where it had already existed. Martin Van Buren's competitors in the election of 1836 were three members of the newly established Whig Party, still a loose coalition bound by mutual opposition to Jackson's anti-bank policies but lacking the party unity or organizational strength to field a single ticket or define a coherent platform. Van Buren won the election with 764,198 popular votes, only 59% of the total, and 170 electoral votes. Harrison led the Whigs with 73 electoral votes, White receiving 26 and Webster 14. Willie P. Mangum of South Carolina received his state's 11 electoral votes. On February 8, 1837, the U.S. Senate convened, and in accordance with the 12th Amendment chose the vice president from the two top electoral vote recipients, Johnson and Granger. Johnson won the contingent vote, 33-17, and became the nation's ninth vice president. Presidency 1837–1841. White House hostess. For the first half of his presidency, Van Buren, who had been a widower for many years, did not have a specific person fill the role of White House hostess at administration social events, but tried to assume such duties himself. When his eldest son Abraham Van Buren married Angelica Singleton in 1838, he quickly acted to install his daughter-in-law as his hostess. She solicited the advice of her distant relative, Dolly Madison. As the nation endured a deep economic depression, newspaper coverage of Angelica Van Buren's receiving style at receptions, influenced by her heavy reading on European court life, and her naive delight in being received as the Queen of the United States when she visited the royal courts of England and France after her marriage, as well as the anecdotal claim that she intended to re-landscape the White House grounds to resemble the royal gardens of Europe, were used in a political attack on her father-in-law by a Pennsylvania Whig Congressman Charles Ogle. He referred obliquely to her as part of the presidential household in his famous Gold Spoon oration. The attack was delivered in Congress, and the depiction of the president as living a royal lifestyle was a primary factor in his defeat for re-election. Panic of 1837. The modern Balaam and his ass. An 1837 caricature placing the blame for the Panic of 1837 and the perilous state of the banking system on outgoing President Andrew Jackson, shown riding a donkey, while President Martin Van Buren comments approvingly. When Van Buren entered office, it was clear that the nation's economic health had taken a turn for the worse and that the prosperity of the early 1830s was over. 2 months into his presidency, on May 10, 1837, some important state banks in New York, running out of hard currency reserves, suddenly refused to convert paper money into gold or silver. Other financial institutions throughout the nation quickly followed suit. This financial crisis would become known as the Panic of 1837. Van Buren blamed the economic collapse on what he viewed as greedy American and foreign business and financial institutions, as well as on the overextension of credit by U.S. banks. Whig leaders in Congress blamed the Democrats, along with Andrew Jackson's economic policies, to deal with the crisis. The Whigs proposed rechartering the national bank. The president countered by proposing the establishment of an independent U.S. Treasury. Such a system would, he asserted, take the politics out of the nation's money supply. The government would hold all of its money balances in the form of gold or silver and would be restricted from printing paper money at will, a measure designed to prevent inflation. By the time Congress finally acted, the nation's economy had been mired in a depression for nearly 4 years. The problems would continue into the early 1840s. More important for Van Buren's immediate future, the depression would be a major issue in his upcoming re-election campaign. Indian removals. Regarding Indian removal, in 1838, Van Buren directed General Winfield Scott to forcibly move all those Cherokee who had not yet complied with the 1835 Treaty of New Echota and departed from the southeastern United States and moved west to present-day Oklahoma. In the course of Van Buren's 4-year-long presidency, the federal government negotiated 19 treaties with Indian nations. The administration also contended with the Seminole in Florida, who engaged the Army in a 7-year battle. Mormons. In 1839, Joseph Smith, Jr., the founder of the Latter-day Saint movement, visited Van Buren to plead for the U.S. to help roughly 20,000 Mormon settlers of Independence, Missouri, who were forced from the state during the 1838 Mormon War. There, the governor of Missouri, Lilburn Boggs, had issued an executive order on October 27, 1838, known as the Extermination Order. It authorized troops to use force against Mormons to exterminate or drive. Texas. In a bold step, Van Buren reversed Andrew Jackson's policies and sought peace at home, as well as abroad. Instead of settling a financial dispute between American citizens and the Mexican government by force, Van Buren wanted to seek a diplomatic solution. In an action that upset political leaders of the pro-slavery states. In August 1837, Van Buren denied Texas' formal request to join the United States, partly to prevent the upset of the slave state-free state balance in the Missouri Compromise, and partly because he hoped to avoid a possible war with Mexico over Texas annexation. Aroostook War. A crisis surfaced in late 1838, in the disputed territory on the Maine, New Brunswick frontier, where Americans began settling on lands claimed by both the United States and Great Britain. Both American and New Brunswick lumbermen cut timber in the disputed territory during the winter of 1838-39. On December 29, New Brunswick lumbermen were spotted cutting down trees on an American estate near the Aroostook River. American woodcutters rushed to stand guard. A shouting match, known as the Battle of Caribou, ensued. Tensions quickly boiled over into a near war with both Maine and New Brunswick arresting each other's citizens. The crisis seemed ready to turn into an armed conflict. To settle the crisis, Van Buren met with the British minister to the United States. They agreed to resolve the border issue diplomatically. Van Buren also sent General Winfield Scott to the northern border area, both to show military resolve, and more importantly, to lower the tensions. Scott successfully convinced all sides to submit the border issue to arbitration. The dispute was put to rest a few years later, with the signing of the Webster-Ashburn Treaty. United States v. the Amistad. In the Amistad case, a freedom suit that involved international issues and parties, as well as United States law, resulting from the rebellion of Africans on board the Spanish schooner La Amistad in 1839, when a federal district court judge ruled that the Africans were legally free and should be transported home. Van Buren had the case appealed to the Supreme Court. In February 1840, former president and sitting U.S. Representative from Massachusetts, John Quincy Adams argued passionately for the Africans' right to freedom. Attorney General Henry D. Gilpin presented the government's case. In March 1841, the Supreme Court issued its final verdict. The Amistad Africans were free people and should be allowed to return home. Cabinet. Martin Van Buren announced his intention to follow in the footsteps of his illustrious predecessor, and retained all but one of Jackson's cabinet. Judicial appointments. Midterm elections of 1838. The Panic of 1837 loomed large over the 1838 election cycle, as the carryover effects of the economic downturn led to Whig gains in both the U.S. House and Senate. Also, while the Democratic Party retained a majority in both chambers. Presidential election of 1840. Van Buren easily won renomination for a second term at the 1840 Democratic National Convention, but he and his party faced a difficult election in 1840. Van Buren's presidency had been a difficult affair, with the U.S. economy mired in a severe downturn, and other divisive issues, such as slavery, Western expansion, and tensions with Great Britain, providing opportunities for Van Buren's political opponents, and even some of his fellow Democrats, to criticize his actions. The Whigs did select Harrison as their nominee, and presented him to the nation as the antithesis of the president, whom they derided as ineffective, corrupt, and effete. Van Buren remained optimistic about his chance for re-election until October 1840, by which time it became unlikely that he would defeat Harrison. An astonishing 80% of eligible voters went to the polls on Election Day. A linguistic legacy of the 1840 campaign was attributed to Van Buren himself, the expression, "okay." Later life. On the expiration of his term, Van Buren returned to his estate, Lindenwold in Kinderhook, where he planned his return to the White House. He seemed likely to be nominated by the Democrats in 1844, but in April of that year a Van Buren letter to William H. Hammett was made public. While in the state Senate, Van Buren voted for a resolution instructing New York's members of Congress to vote against the admission of Missouri as a slave state. However, despite these anti-slavery views, during his term of office there was no ambiguity about his position on the abolition of slavery. After leaving the White House, Van Buren grew increasingly opposed to slavery, and his earlier views about its constitutional standing gave way over time to acceptance of anti-slavery positions, including opposing slavery's expansion into newly organized Western states. Unlike many anti-slavery Democrats of the 1840s and 1850s, who later joined the Republican Party, Van Buren and most of his followers remained in the Democratic fold, including his son John Van Buren and Samuel J. Tilden, who later served as governor of New York and was the Democratic nominee for president in 1876. In the election of 1860, he supported Stephen A. Douglas, the candidate of Northern Democrats, and helped create a fusion ticket in New York of Democratic electors pledged to both Douglas and John C. Breckinridge. But Abraham Lincoln carried New York and every northern state except New Jersey. Van Buren's health began to fail later in 1861, and he was bedridden with pneumonia during the fall and winter of 1861-62. Memorials. Martin Van Buren appears on the obverse side of a $1 coin of the 2007-2016 presidential $1 coin program. Counties. Counties are named for Martin Van Buren in Michigan, Iowa, Arkansas, and Tennessee. Cities and towns. In addition, Van Buren Township in LaPorte County, Indiana was later merged with Noble Township. Van Buren, Anderson County. The small community was abandoned due to the construction and flooding of Taylorsville Lake from 1974 to 1983. Van Buren Charter Township, Michigan and Martin, Michigan. In addition, the now-defunct village of Martinsville in Sumter Township was named for him. Van Buren Township, Shelby County, Ohio. This township started to be populated by white settlers in the early 1830s. It was incorporated in 1835, and its government organized in 1841. Van Buren Township, Putnam County, Ohio. Originally part of Blanchard Township, it was surveyed in 1821, became home to its first white settlers in 1835, and was organized in 1843. Van Buren, Hardman County, unincorporated, established in 1831. This unincorporated populated area is located at the intersection of Van Buren and Lake Hardman roads, and shares a zip code with Hickory Valley. Van Buren, Grant County. In 1841, this unincorporated area was combined with unincorporated areas named for Lafayette and Osceola to form the incorporated town of Potosi. State parks. Van Buren State Park. Mountains. Islands. Van Buren Island in the St. Lawrence River, part of the Thousand Islands, sits at latitude 44, 404, 339 N, 75, 892119 W. Though named for the U.S. President, this island is in Canadian waters. Ships. USS Van Buren, a United States Navy schooner in service from 1839 to 1847, was also named for Martin Van Buren. Schools. In popular culture. During the 1988 presidential campaign, George H.W. Bush, a Yale University graduate and member of the Skull and Bones Secret Society, was attempting to become the first incumbent vice president to win election to the presidency since Van Buren. In the comic strip Doonesbury, artist Gary Trudeau depicted members of Skull and Bones as attempting to rob Van Buren's grave, apparently intending to use the relics in a ritual that would aid Bush in the election. On the television show Seinfeld, the episode, The Van Buren Boys, is about a fictional street gang that admires Van Buren and bases its rituals and symbols on him, including the hand sign of 8 fingers pointing up. 8 fingers signifies Van Buren, the 8th president. Martin Van Buren was portrayed by Nigel Hawthorne in the 1997 film Amistad. The film depicts the controversy and legal battle surrounding the status of slaves who in 1839 rebelled against their transporters on l'Amistad slave ship. In Episode 1 Season 2 of Veep Midterms, Vice President Selena Meyer is told that a colleague's office is opposite the picture of Fat Wolverine. In an early scene of the film Two Faces of January, the main characters, American expatriates in Athens, encounter an American tourist and discover that she is a Van Buren descendant. They then argue over whether Martin Van Buren was the 7th or 8th president. The USS Van Buren is a fictional Navy aircraft carrier named for President Van Buren, which has appeared in the television show NCIS: Los Angeles. During the 2016 presidential campaign, a #FeelTheBuren hashtag was created on Twitter as a parody of Bernie Sanders' #FeelTheBuren campaign slogan. Books by Van Buren. Van Buren, Martin Van Buren, Abraham Van Buren, John eds. Inquiry into the Origin and Course of Political Parties in the United States. New York, Hurd and Houghton. ISBN 1-4181-29240. Van Buren, Martin. Fitzpatrick, John Clement, ed. The Autobiography of Martin Van Buren. Annual Report of the American Historical Association for the year 1918. 2. Washington, D.C. GOVT. Print. Off. ISBN 0-678-00531-1. Books about Van Buren. Curtis, James C. The Fox at Bay. Martin Van Buren and the Presidency. 1837-1841. Lexington, University Press of Kentucky. ISBN 978-0813112145. Derthick, Martha. Dilemmas of Scale in America's Federal Democracy. Cambridge University Press. ISBN 978-0521-64039-8. Retrieved 2 March 2015. Henrietta, James A. Martin Van Buren. In Brinkley, Allen. Dyer, Davis. The American Presidency. Boston, Houghton Mifflin Company. pp. 103, 114. ISBN 0-618-38273-9. Holt, Michael F. The Rise and Fall of the American Whig Party. Jacksonian Politics and the Onset of the Civil War. New York, Oxford University Press. ISBN 978-0-19-50554443. Niven, John. Martin Van Buren. The Romantic Age of American Politics. New York, Oxford University Press. ISBN 978-0-19-503238-3. Schuler, James. History of the United States of America. 1831. 1847. Democrats and Whigs. 4. Washington, D.C. W. H. Morrison. Silby, Joel H. Party Over Section. The Rough and Ready Presidential Election of 1848. Lawrence, Kansas. University Press of Kansas. ISBN 978-0-7006-1640-4. Martin Van Buren was an American politician who served as the 8th President of the United States, a member of the Democratic Party. He served in a number of other senior roles, including 8th Vice President and 10th Secretary of State, both under Andrew Jackson. Van Buren won the presidency by promising to follow through on Jackson's policies. Shortly after taking office, the Panic of 1837 struck the nation, and his inability to deal effectively with the economic crisis, combined with the growing political strength of the opposition Whig Party, led to his defeat in the 1840 presidential election. During his half-century of public service, he built, perfected, and defended a new system of political parties at first the state and then the federal level. In New York, he reorganized the Democratic-Republican Party and established the Albany Regency to keep it in power. He then moved on Washington, where he did more than anyone to construct the modern Democratic Party, which dominated American politics down to the American Civil War. A delegate to a political convention at age 18, he quickly moved from local to state politics, gaining fame both as a political organizer and an accomplished lawyer. Elected to the Senate by the New York State Legislature in 1821, Van Buren supported William H. Crawford for president in the 1824 election, but by 1828 had come to support Jackson. Van Buren was a major supporter and organizer for Jackson in the 1828 election, and ran for governor of New York in the hope of using his personal popularity to boost Jackson's campaign. Jackson and Van Buren were elected, and after serving as fair in the 1840 election, Van Buren was voted out of office, losing to Whig candidate William Henry Harrison. Van Buren was the leading candidate for the Democratic nomination in 1844, but lost to James K. Polk, who went on to win the election. In the 1848 election, Van Buren ran unsuccessfully as the candidate of the anti-slavery Free Soil Party. He returned to the Democratic fold to endorse Franklin Pierce, James Buchanan, and Stephen A. Douglas for the presidency. However, his increasingly abolitionist views and support for the Union led him to support Abraham Lincoln's policies after the start of the American Civil War. Van Buren's health began to fail in 1861, and he died in July 1862 at the age of 79. Early life and ex-governor for 2 months. Van Buren resigned to become Jackson's Secretary of State. During Jackson's 8 years as president, Van Buren was a key advisor, and built the organizational structure for the coalescing Democratic Party, particularly in New York. In 1831, following his resignation as Secretary of State, which aided Jackson in resolving the Petticoat affair, Jackson gave Van Buren a recess appointment as American Minister to Britain. Van Buren's nomination was rejected by the Senate, cutting short his service in London, but he was elected vice president in the 1832 election. Van Buren faced little opposition for the presidential nomination at the 1835 Democratic National Convention, and he defeated several Whig opponents in the 1836 presidential election. Van Buren was the first president to be born a United States citizen of Dutch ancestry. He is the only president who spoke English as a second language, and was the first not to have a university degree or a military commission. As president, Van Buren was blamed for the Depression of 1837. Hostile newspapers called him Martin Van Ruin. He attempted to cure the economic problems by keeping control of federal funds in an independent treasury, rather than in state banks. But Congress would not approve of this until 1840. In foreign affairs, he denied the application of Texas for admission to the Union, unwilling to upset the balance of free and slave states in the Missouri Compromise, and hoping to avoid war with Mexico over Texas annexation. Additionally, relations with Britain and its colonies in Canada proved to be strained from the bloodless Aroostook War in the Carolina